It all started with a book, but the chill began with the man who carried it. He didn't just look old, he looked hollowed out, as if something had scooped out his insides, leaving only a brittle shell of skin and bone. His eyes, wide and unblinking, held the frantic terror of a man who has stared into an abyss and seen something stare back. He placed the object on my counter with hands that trembled not from age, but from a deep, resonant fear. "You have to look," he rasped, his voice a dry whisper of rustling leaves and graveyard dust. "You are the only one who might understand." The object was less a book and more a cage. Its cover was beaten copper, riveted over dark, petrified wood. The symbols etched into the patina weren't just decorative. They seemed to squirm at the edge of my vision, part Proto-Sanskrit, part something hideously alien that made the back of my neck prickle. A faint, metallic odor rose from it, like ozone after a lightning strike, mingled with something else, something vaguely like scorched meat. This was for Croft's Tomes and Folios, my small antiquarian bookshop in a forgotten London corner, a place for quiet histories. Not this. I am Julian Croft, its curator, and until that moment, I believed the most dangerous thing in my shop was a first edition with a cracked spine. My hands hesitated before touching it. Inside, thin sheets of hammered bronze served as pages, but it was a tiny mark on the inside back cover that made the air freeze in my lungs. A small, spiraling glyph, so cleverly hidden within the esoteric patterns that it was meant to be found only by someone who knew precisely where to look. I knew. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of its own. It was the personal mark of Dr. R.S. Thorne. 6 months ago, R.S. had vanished from my life. My R.S., a brilliant, dangerously passionate archaeologist, obsessed with out-of-place artifacts. Her last contact was a cryptic, encrypted email from Cairo, hinting she was close to exposing a group that plundered history for profit. Then, nothing. She was gone, erased from the world as cleanly as if she'd never existed. Now, here was her mark. This wasn't a breadcrumb. It was a scream trapped in metal. My trembling fingers found the vellum page tucked inside, a desperate addendum from a 16th century Jesuit missionary, Father Matteo. Shipwrecked, he was taken in by a tribe living in the shadow of a city of glass. They were keepers of this bronze book, the Agnes Smriti, memory of fire, and worshipped beings they called the Vaimanika, the sky sailors. He wrote that the book detailed the city's self-destruction, a sunfire unleashed from within that had melted stone to glass in a heartbeat. He spoke of its heart, a source of power that sang a song of unmaking. He'd stolen the book, believing it a demonic artifact. Varana, I murmured, the name feeling like a shard of glass on my tongue. The old man flinched at the word. "My grandfather went looking for it," he whispered, his eyes darting towards the shadows in my shop. "He followed the whispers from that book. He came back. Wrong. He said it wasn't empty. He said things sleep in the glass." He pushed the book towards me, his touch recoiling as if from a hot coal. "Take it. It doesn't belong in the world of the living. But maybe you can stop the song." He fled my shop without another word, leaving the bronze codex on my counter, its silence now more terrifying than any scream. This book was no longer just a map to an ancient wonder. It was the only road back to Eris. I had to go. But the book didn't just speak of history. It spoke of guardians, not born of flesh, and traps that preyed on the mind. I'm a scholar. I needed a blunt instrument. I needed a monster to fight other monsters. I needed Jack Riley. I found Jack Wreck Riley holding court in a South London pub so grimy, the shadows seemed to have substance. He was a human battering ram, with a shock of red hair and a grin that suggested he was on intimate terms with violence. "Well, well, look what the cat dragged in and left on the doorstep," he boomed as I approached, his voice a cheerful gravel slide. "If it isn't Professor Croft, down from his ivory tower to grace us mortals with his presence. Lose your library card?" "I need your help finding someone, Jack," I said, my voice steady despite the noise. "A man named Kalen." The grin didn't vanish, but it tightened, the humor in his eyes sharpening to a dangerous point. "Kalen," he repeated, his voice dropping low enough to cut through the din. He gestured to a decrepit booth in the corner with his half-empty pint glass. "Let's talk about the kind of trouble you're trying to get into." Once seated, I kept it brief. A map, a site of immense value in the Thar Desert. Danger. The best specialist required. Jack took a long pull from his pint. "Kalen's not just the best. He's a bloody ghost story people tell around campfires. He's what you get when you mix an archaeologist with a spook and something that crawled out of a tomb. You don't find him. You make a sufficiently interesting offering to the universe and hope he finds you first." He eyed me. "What's the offering?" "A pristine 15th century astrolabe," I said. Jack whistled softly. "That'll get his attention. And what's the hook? He doesn't get out of his dusty crypt for simple treasure." "A city of glass that sang itself to death," I said. "And this." I slid the bronze book across the sticky table. He didn't open it. He just stared at the unsettling symbols on the cover. "Right," he said, a slow, predatory smile returning. "That'll do it. My services will cost you, Julian, a lot, and that's just to get you in the same room with the spook." 2 nights later, in a warehouse by the Thames that smelled of river rot and dead things, he appeared. One moment, I was staring at a wall of shadows between 2 stacks of crates. The next, one of the shadows detached itself and became a man. He was lean and still, wearing simple dark clothing. His face was unreadable, but his eyes absorbed the meager light and gave nothing back. He was holding my astrolabe, turning it over in his hands as if it were a curious pebble. This was Kalen. "Show him the book," Jack prompted, his voice unusually subdued. I placed the codex on a crate. Moonlight from a broken window fell across the bizarre symbols. Kalen circled it, his gaze sharp and analytical. His eyes locked onto the script, and for a half-second, a flicker of something ancient and weary passed across his face. He looked up, his gaze pinning me in place. "The Argentum Collective," he said, his voice a low baritone that seemed to vibrate in the air. "Are they involved?" It wasn't a question. It was an accusation. Jack shook his head. "Not yet. But the scent of a place like this, they'll be on it." The name hit me like a physical blow. The multinational corporation Eris had mentioned in her last email. The plunderers of history. Kalen's unnerving gaze shifted to me. "This isn't just about a lost city for you." I drew a shaky breath and pointed to the spiral glyph hidden on the cover. "An archaeologist disappeared 6 months ago. Eris Thorne. This was her mark. I think she's there, or she knows what this book really is. I'm going to find her." A profound, ancient gravity settled in Kalen's eyes. He looked from my face to the book, a silent calculation taking place behind that impenetrable stare. "The song of unmaking is not meant for the living," he stated quietly. Then, he gave a curt nod. "When do we leave?" An unspoken pact formed in the cold, damp air. A scholar searching for a ghost, a soldier of fortune sniffing a big score, and a man who seemed to be a ghost himself, hunting secrets of his own. We were 3 mismatched points of a triangle, drawn together by the dark gravity of a place that shouldn't exist. Getting to the Thar Desert was one thing. Getting to a specific unmapped point within it was another. Jack handled the logistics with military precision. We flew into Jodhpur, the Blue City, on a commercial flight. From there, it was a series of ever more rickety forms of transport. A rattling bus, a hired jeep, and finally, 2 ill-tempered camels that Jack immediately nicknamed Stinky and Bitey. Our guide, a local man named Kennel, had a face like a dried riverbed and claimed to know the desert better than his own wife. He led us for 3 days into the searing emptiness. The sun was a merciless hammer, and the landscape was a monotonous vista of sand and sky. "The place you seek is in the Dahan," Kennel told us one evening, his teeth stained red from chewing betel nut. "The scorched lands, a place of bad spirits. They say the sand there glows at night with a sickly green light." On the 4th day, we reached a series of stark, black rock formations that jutted from the sand like broken teeth. This was the landmark from the Bronze Book. From here, we were on our own. We paid Kennel handsomely, and he left with the camels, making a sign to ward off evil as he went. "All right, gentlemen," Jack said, checking his GPS. It was useless. The screen just showed a blank, featureless expanse. "From here on, we're relying on ancient tech." He grinned at me. "No pressure, bookworm." I had the Bronze Book. Over the past few weeks, I had managed to translate a significant portion of the directional cipher. It was a masterpiece of ancient ingenuity. It didn't provide a map in the traditional sense. It provided instructions based on celestial navigation and the subtle properties of the land. "We wait for dusk," I announced. "The book says to follow the shadow of the tallest tooth as it drinks the setting sun. Then, we walk until the twin stars of the serpent's eye are directly overhead." Kalen, who had been silent for most of the journey, merely nodded. He had an unnerving economy of motion, conserving energy in the oppressive heat, while Jack and I were constantly sweating and shifting. He knelt and scooped up a handful of sand, letting it run through his fingers. "Iron," he murmured, "high concentration." As dusk fell, a long, sharp shadow stretched out from the tallest rock spire. We followed its path, a straight line pointing deeper into the desert. The heat began to recede, replaced by a biting cold. The desert at night was a different beast entirely, vast and unnervingly silent. We walked for hours under a canopy of brilliant stars. I used my compass and a star chart to locate the constellation the book called the Serpent, likely a local name for what we knew as Draco. Finally, the 2 stars that formed its eyes, Rastaban and Eltanin, were at their zenith. According to the book, we were supposed to find a hollow stone that sings in the wind. We fanned out, searching. It was Jack who found it, a large, weathered boulder with several holes bored through it, creating a low, moaning sound as the night wind passed through. "Now what, Julian?" he asked, his voice hushed. I consulted the codex, my headlamp illuminating the bronze pages. "The next step is odd. It says, 'Offer a voice of fire, and the path will be revealed.'" "A voice of fire?" Jack scoffed. "What's that supposed to mean? Yell at a matchstick?" Before I could answer, Kalen acted. He took a small flask from his pack. Not water, something else. He poured a small amount of clear liquid onto the sand, then drew a strange, looping symbol in the wet patch with his finger. He took a flint and steel and struck a spark. The liquid erupted in a flash of brilliant green flame. It didn't burn like a normal fire. It didn't consume anything. It was a column of cold, silent light that hissed and spat, casting long, dancing shadows. And in that unholy light, we saw it. About 50 yards away, the sand began to shift. Not like it was blown by the wind, but like it was being drawn downwards. A whirlpool of sand formed, revealing the edges of something dark and geometric. Slowly, silently, a set of steps was uncovered, leading down into the blackness beneath the desert. Jack let out a low whistle. "Well, I'll be damned," a voice of fire. Kalen was already at the edge of the staircase, his eyes scanning the darkness below. He said nothing, but his posture was tense, alert. He had drawn a long, wicked-looking knife from a sheath on his belt. The green flame died as suddenly as it had appeared, plunging us back into the moonlight. The staircase remained, a gaping maw in the heart of the desert, the entrance to the Vitrified Citadel. "I have a very bad feeling about this," I muttered, my heart hammering against my ribs. Jack clapped me on the shoulder, his grin a slash of white in the darkness. "That, my friend," he said, racking the slide on his handgun with a deafening clack-clack, "is how you know you're in the right place." The steps were not stone. They were made of a smooth black material that felt like obsidian, but was strangely warm to the touch. It seemed to absorb the beams of our headlamps, reflecting no light. The air grew cooler and denser as we descended, carrying a faint metallic tang, like the air after a lightning strike. The staircase opened into a vast circular chamber. The scale of it was staggering, larger than any cathedral dome I had ever seen. The walls, the floor, the ceiling, everything was made of the same seamless black glass. But it wasn't uniform. Swirls of deep blue and angry red were trapped within it, like a frozen storm. "Vitrification," I breathed, running a hand over the glassy wall. It was perfectly smooth. The heat required to do this to sandstone on this scale, it's astronomical. Beyond any volcano or conventional weapon. "Looks like our Father Mateo wasn't exaggerating," Jack said, his voice echoing unnaturally in the vast space. He had a powerful flashlight, its beam cutting a swath through the darkness, but the light seemed to struggle, to be swallowed by the oppressive blackness. Kalen wasn't looking at the walls. His attention was fixed on the center of the chamber. There stood a single, massive pillar, also of black glass. It pulsed with a soft internal light, a faint, rhythmic violet glow. Etched into its surface were the same geometric symbols as the bronze book. "It's a map," Kalen said, his voice low. "The layout of the city's upper levels." He traced the symbols with his fingertips, his brow furrowed in concentration. "The chambers are arranged in concentric rings. This is the vestibule. The rings lead inwards, towards the core, but the paths are conditional." "What does that mean?" I asked, stepping closer. "They change," he replied. "The passages are gated. The gates respond to specific frequencies, sound." Jack grunted. "Singing doors. Lovely." Not just any sound, I realized, the pieces clicking into place. The book mentioned traps that harness sound. A silent scream opens the way of whispers. A roaring heart stills the shrieking hall. "Riddles," Jack groaned. "I hate riddles." "They're not riddles," Kalen corrected. "They're instructions. This place is a machine. A broken one." He pointed to a symbol on the pillar. It depicted a wave pattern. "This is the frequency for the first gate. It's low, a subharmonic hum." He looked around the chamber, then at us. He put a finger to his lips, then pointed to his own chest. He took a deep, controlled breath, and from his throat came a low, resonant hum, almost too deep to hear. It was a perfect, sustained note. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, a low vibration filled the air, seeming to come from the very walls around us. Across the chamber, a section of the seamless black wall began to retract, sliding away with a silent, grinding motion to reveal a dark corridor. "Show off," Jack muttered, but he looked impressed. The corridor beyond was narrow and claustrophobic. The glassy walls seemed to press in on us. The air was stale, dead. There were no decorations, no signs of life as we knew it. No furniture, no pottery, no art. Just the endless, swirling black glass. This wasn't a place for living. It was a conduit. We walked for what felt like an eternity. The only sounds were our footsteps and our own breathing. Then we came to the first real test. It was a long hall, wider than the corridor. The floor was not flat, but a series of wide, shallow platforms suspended over a chasm of indeterminate depth. The platforms were connected by narrow beams of the same black material. "Pressure plates," Jack said immediately, his military instincts taking over. "Standard stuff. Step on the wrong one, and you take a long drop to a short death." Kalen shook his head. He pointed his flashlight beam down into the chasm. There was something down there, something that glinted. Not metal. It looked like crystal shards, thousands of them, lining the bottom of the pit. He picked up a small, loose fragment of glass from the corridor entrance and tossed it onto the first platform. Nothing happened. He tossed another onto the second. Again, nothing. He threw a third piece onto the platform in the middle of the hall. The instant it touched the surface, a high-pitched, piercing shriek erupted from the walls. It was a sound of pure agony, so intense it felt like a drill boring into my skull. I clapped my hands over my ears, but it was useless. The sound was inside my head, and the crystal shards at the bottom of the pit began to resonate, glowing with a fierce white light and vibrating violently. They were tuning forks, and whatever was down there was being activated by the sound. Kalen, seemingly unaffected by the noise, acted instantly. He drew his knife and, with a flick of his wrist, threw it with impossible accuracy. It didn't hit the platform. It struck the wall next to it. Clang! The pure metallic note of the knife hitting the vitrified wall was different from the shriek. It was a dissonant frequency. And it had an immediate effect. The shrieking sound faltered, a discordant feedback loop interrupting the signal. The crystals in the pit dimmed. He had broken the resonance. He gestured for us to cross, quickly. We moved along the beams, our boots making soft sounds on the glass. I didn't dare look down. The shrieking sound was trying to re-establish itself, wavering in and out of existence. We made it to the other side just as the sound returned to its full, mind-shattering intensity. We scrambled into the next corridor, and Kalen pulled a thick, heavy door shut behind us. It wasn't on hinges, but slid out from the wall, and it dampened the sound to a muted hum. I leaned against the wall, my head throbbing, my stomach churning. What was that? "A sonic trap," Kalen said, retrieving his knife from the door where it had embedded itself. The platform triggered a specific resonant frequency. The crystals below amplify it. If it reaches full power, it would liquefy organic matter. "It would turn us into soup," Jack translated, his face pale. "Charming." I looked at Kalen, at his calm, unreadable face. He had identified the trap, its mechanism, and its solution in a matter of seconds. He hadn't just saved our lives. He had done it with an understanding of this alien place that was simply not human. "How did you know what to do?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Kalen cleaned his knife on his trousers and sheathed it. He looked at me, and for the first time, I saw something in his dark eyes. It wasn't arrogance or pride. It was something much older. It was familiarity. "There are echoes of this architecture in other places," he said cryptically. "The patterns are always the same." He turned and started down the new corridor. "Let's keep moving. The deeper we go, the louder the echoes become." The next chamber was a stark contrast to the sterile geometric halls we had just navigated. It was a vast, cavernous space that must have once been open to the sky, though the ceiling was now a vault of vitrified rock, sagging inwards like melted wax. The floor was covered in a thick layer of fine gray dust, and rising from it were crystalline structures that looked disturbingly like trees. They were beautiful and horrifying. Twisted, thorny branches of what looked like quartz and amethyst reached towards the dark ceiling, catching the light of our lamps and fracturing it into 1,000 tiny rainbows. There was no sign of life, no insects, no birds, just this silent, crystalline forest. A hydroponics bay? Jack wondered aloud, kicking at the base of one of the trees. It rang with a clear, bell-like tone. Or maybe just a really weird art installation. No, I said, kneeling to examine the gray dust. It was too fine for sand, too uniform. It's ash. The entire floor is covered in it. I realized with a sickening lurch what it was. It's organic. Kalen was already moving through the grove, his steps silent in the thick ash. He wasn't looking at the crystal trees, but at the walls of the cavern. They were covered in carvings, but not the clean, geometric lines we'd seen before. These were figurative. They depicted tall, slender beings with elongated limbs and large, dark eyes. The Vaimanika. The carvings told a story. They showed the beings tending to the crystal trees, which in these depictions glowed with an inner light. They showed them harvesting crystalline fruits and consuming them. In one disturbing panel, a being lay on a plinth, and as it died, its body dissolved, leaving behind a new, small crystal sapling. It was a garden, I murmured, piecing it together. A life cycle. They didn't eat food as we do. They cultivated and consumed this crystal flora, and when they died, they became it. They were part mineral, part something else. So where are they all now? Jack asked, his hand resting on the butt of his gun. This place feels empty, but it doesn't feel dead. His words were prophetic. As we moved deeper into the garden, we began to hear it. A soft, whispering sound, like voices on the edge of hearing. The whispers seemed to emanate from the crystals themselves. They weren't in any language I could recognize, but they carried an emotional weight, a sense of profound sorrow, and a chilling undercurrent of fear. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. They began to worm their way into my thoughts, planting images in my mind. I saw flashes of blinding light, felt a wave of unimaginable heat. I saw the crystal trees shattering, the slender beings turning to ash in an instant. It was a psychic echo, the last terrified moments of an entire civilization imprinted on the very fabric of this chamber. It's a trap, Kalen said, his voice cutting through the mental chatter. A psychic minefield. Don't listen. Focus on your own thoughts. It was easier said than done. The whispers were seductive, pulling at my consciousness, promising knowledge in exchange for just a moment of my attention. I saw Jack clenching his fists, his jaw tight, sweat beading on his forehead. Even he was struggling. Kalen, however, seemed immune. He moved with purpose towards the center of the garden, where a single massive crystal tree stood. It was different from the others, made of a smoky, dark red crystal, and it was the source of the most intense whispers. At its base was a basin, and floating in the center of the basin was a perfect, crystalline sphere, about the size of a human heart. It pulsed with a soft, red light, and the whispers of 1,000,000 dying souls poured from it. That's it, Kalen stated. The nexus of the echo. It's broadcasting their final moments on a loop. So we smash it? Jack asked, raising his gun. No, Kalen stopped him. The psychic energy is contained. A violent release could be unpredictable. It might just kill us. It might do much worse. He pointed to the base of the giant crystal. Carved around it was a series of channels, like a circuit board. We need to divert the energy, bleed it off safely. He began pointing out specific crystals in the grove, smaller ones that seemed to be key nodes in the network. Julian, The carvings on the wall, they show the cultivation process. There must be a sequence, a way to harvest the energy without destroying the system. While Kalen worked on the central nexus, trying to find a way to interface with it, Jack and I became his hands. Following his instructions and my frantic translations of the wall carvings, we moved through the garden, touching the crystal trees in a specific sequence. Each time we touched one, its internal light would dim slightly, and the pitch of its resonant hum would change. The cacophony of whispers began to subside, focusing, coalescing into a single coherent thought. It was a single word, repeated over and over. A name. Asura. Finally, we touched the last crystal in the sequence. For a moment, there was absolute silence. The psychic pressure vanished. Then, the red sphere in the basin at the center of the grove flared brightly, one last time, and went dark. The entire garden was plunged into silence and shadow, the only light now coming from our headlamps. I slumped against a crystal trunk, exhausted. The mental assault was over. Asura, I said, the name feeling foul in my mouth. In Hindu mythology, the Asuras were divine beings, often power-seeking and demonic, rivals of the Devas. Sometimes a myth is just a memory that's been retold too many times, Kalen said, looking down at the now inert sphere. He reached into the basin and lifted it out. It was cool to the touch. He turned it over in his hands. On one side, previously hidden by the light, was a symbol. It was a complex, multi-layered spiral. "What is it?" Jack asked. Kalen's expression was grim. "It's a key. Not for a door in this city." He looked at me, his dark eyes holding a gravity I had never seen before. "It's for the cage." The corridor leading out of the Whispering Garden was different. The seamless black glass gave way to rough-hewn stone, scarred and blackened. The air grew heavy, thick with the smell of ozone and something else, something acrid and deeply wrong. We were descending, spiraling deeper into the earth. "We're getting close to the core," Kalen said, his voice a low rumble. "The vitrification isn't as complete here. The Sunfire event Father Mateo wrote about, it originated from the level below us." The corridor opened into a chamber that defied Euclidean geometry. It was a sphere of immense size, and we were standing on a narrow catwalk that clung to its equator. Above and below us was a dizzying void. In the exact center of the sphere, suspended by what looked like invisible forces, was a pulsating orb of white-hot energy, the size of a small house. It was contained within a cage of interlocking, spinning rings made of the same black material as the catwalk. This was the city's power source, the heart. The heat was intense, even from this distance. The air shimmered. The orb emitted a low, powerful hum. The song from the priest's journal. It wasn't a melody. It was the sound of pure, raw power, a vibration that resonated deep in my bones. "That's a star," Jack breathed, his usual bravado gone, replaced by pure awe. "They bottled a bloody star." "A miniature fusion reactor," I corrected, though the term felt laughably inadequate. "The energy output, it's unimaginable." "And unstable," Kalen added, pointing towards the cage. "Look." I followed his gaze. One of the rings in the containment field was wobbling, its rotation slightly out of sync with the others. With every rotation, it scraped against the ring next to it, letting off a shower of blue sparks. And with every spark, the star within the cage seemed to bulge, to lash out against its prison. That's what caused the meltdown, I realized. A mechanical failure. A single, tiny flaw in a system of cosmic power. Our goal, according to the final instructions in the Bronze Book, was not the star itself. It was a control chamber located directly beneath it, accessible by a maintenance spire that descended from our catwalk. The book promised the Navratna, the 9 jewels, a set of control crystals that supposedly regulated the entire citadel. Right, Jack said, squaring his shoulders. Down we go. Let's grab the shiny things and get the hell out of Dodge before this whole place goes supernova. The descent down the spire was terrifying. The metal rungs were hot to the touch, and the hum from the contained star grew into a deafening roar. The light was blinding, forcing us to shield our eyes. The control room was a small hemispherical chamber directly under the caged star. In the center was a console, a raised dais with 9 indentations, arranged in a circle. All of them were empty. "They're gone," I said, a wave of disappointment washing over me. "Someone got here first." "No," Kalen said. His attention was elsewhere. He was looking at the shadows in the room. "We're not alone." And then I saw it. In the corner of the room, there was a heap of something that looked like discarded molten slag. But as I watched, it began to move. It unfolded itself, rising from the floor with a sound like grinding stone. It wasn't a Vimanica. It was something else entirely. It was roughly humanoid, but its body was a chaotic mass of vitrified stone and raw crystalline growths held together by sheer will. It had no face, only a single glowing red optic in the center of its head that burned with cold intelligence. This thing wasn't a guard that had been left behind. It was a prisoner, or a warden. "Asura," Kalen whispered, raising his knife. The creature's head snapped towards him, its red eye fixing on the crystalline sphere from the garden, which Kalen held in his hand. A voice echoed in our minds, not like the whispers before, but a clear, commanding psychic projection. It was ancient, powerful, and filled with undiluted malice. "So much for diplomacy," Jack gritted out, and opened fire. The roar of his handgun was deafening in the small chamber. The bullets sparked and ricocheted off the creature's rocky hide, having no effect. The Asura moved. It wasn't fast, but it was relentless. It swiped at Jack with an arm of jagged obsidian, forcing him to dive out of the way. The claws scraped against the wall, sending splinters of stone flying. "It was the warden," I yelled over the din. "The Vimanica didn't just build this place as a city, it was a prison. They caged the star, and they caged this thing with it." Kalen darted forward, not at the creature, but at the console. He slammed the crystalline sphere, the key, into the central indentation. The console flared to life, and the symbols on it began to glow. The Asura boomed in our minds. "The jewels aren't treasure," Kalen called out. "They're fail-safes. A dead man's switch." He began pressing the symbols on the console in a rapid sequence. "Julian, the book, the shutdown sequence, now." I fumbled for the codex, my hands shaking. I found the final page, the Song of Unmaking. It was a complex diagram. "It's not a song. It's a sequence of vibrational alignments. You have to vent the power, Kalen." The Asura ignored me and Jack. It was focused entirely on Kalen and the console. It lunged, its massive form crashing towards him. Jack emptied his clip into its back to no effect. It was unstoppable. Just as its claws were about to descend on Kalen, he hit the final symbol. A klaxon of unbearable volume blared through the chamber. Red lights flashed. The hum of the star above us changed pitch, rising to an ear-splitting shriek. The Asura projected, and for the first time, there was a note of something other than malice in its voice. There was fear. A beam of pure white energy lanced down from the caged star, striking the Asura in the center of its mass. The creature let out a silent, psychic scream of agony as its body was consumed, its rocky form dissolving into incandescent plasma. In seconds, it was gone. The energy beam cut off, and the entire citadel began to shake. That was the primary containment purge, Kalen yelled over the roar of the dying citadel. It destroyed the Asura, but it also destabilized the core. We have to get out. Now! The control room was falling apart. Chunks of the ceiling rained down around us. The catwalk we had descended from was gone, vaporized. "No way back up," Jack shouted, pointing to a maintenance tunnel that had been blasted open by the purge. "It's a long shot, but it might lead out." There was no time to argue. We scrambled into the tunnel, a narrow tube barely wide enough to crawl through. Behind us, the roar of the dying star was growing, the light from the chamber turning an angry, bloody red. The tunnel was a nightmare of shaking metal and intense heat. It was a service conduit, a maze of pipes and cables, some of which were now spitting sparks and venting superheated steam. We moved as fast as we could, Kalen in the lead, his movements economical and sure even in the chaos. "The whole structure is collapsing," I gasped, the air thick with dust. "The vitrified glass can't handle the vibrations." "It's not just collapsing," Kalen countered, his voice tight. "It's unmaking itself. The energy being released isn't just heat and light. It's affecting local reality. This whole place is about to be erased." He was right. As I looked back, I could see the tunnel behind us wavering, its edges blurring like a photograph dissolving in water. The very fabric of space was coming undone. We burst out of the tunnel into another one of the city's vast, circular corridors. But this one was a scene of utter devastation. The black glass walls were fractured, great cracks spreading across them like spiderwebs. Through the cracks, I could see not rock or sand, but a swirling, chaotic void of pure color. "Which way?" Jack yelled. Kalen didn't hesitate. He pointed down one of the corridors. "That way. It leads towards the outer ring. The angle of ascent is steepest there." We ran. We ran through halls that were shattering around us, dodging falling shards of reality-warping glass. We leaped over chasms that opened in the floor, revealing the screaming void beneath. The city was dying, and it was taking its own geometry with it. We finally reached the great vestibule, where we had first entered. The central pillar that had served as a map was now a shattered wreck, and the grand staircase was gone, collapsed into a pit of rubble. The only way out was up, a sheer 100-foot climb to the desert floor. "I'll go first," Jack said, pulling a coil of rope and a grappling hook from his pack. "Cover me." He didn't need to say it twice. As he began to climb, hooking the rope to a stable-looking outcrop, the rubble below us began to glow. It wasn't a natural heat. The stones were transforming, melting, reforming into new, horrifying shapes. Writhing tentacles of molten rock, snapping maws of crystal. The city's dying energy was giving a final, spastic life to the inanimate stone around us. "They're called Agni Jiva," Kalen said, his knife in his hand as he kicked away a tendril of rock that lashed at him. "Fire souls." The book described them as the final defense. I fumbled in my pack for the only weapon I had, a flare gun. It wasn't much, but it was something. I fired a flare into the largest of the emerging creatures. It exploded with a hiss, doing little damage but momentarily distracting it. Jack was at the top. He secured the rope and yelled, "Kalen, get Julian up here." Kalen grabbed me by the collar. "Climb," he ordered. He didn't wait for my answer, practically throwing me at the rope. My hands, soft and unused to this kind of work, screamed in protest as I pulled myself up, stone and sand raining down on me. Below, Kalen was a whirlwind of motion. He wasn't fighting the creatures. He was redirecting them, using their own clumsy lunges to make them crash into each other. He was buying me time. I reached the top, scrambling over the edge into the blessed, cold night air of the desert. Jack hauled me to my feet. "Where's Kalen?" I looked down. Kalen was at the base of the rope, but he wasn't climbing. He was looking back into the heart of the dying city. The light from below was now an incandescent white, a miniature sun about to be born. "Kalen!" I screamed. "The rope!" He looked up at us. His face, illuminated by the terrible light, was calm. He gave us a single, slow nod, a nod of finality. Then he turned and ran back into the city. "What is he doing?" Jack roared. "He's not coming," I whispered, the horrifying truth dawning on me. "He's making sure it's contained. He's closing the door from the other side." Before we could do anything, the ground beneath us bucked violently. A wave of pure heat washed over us, and a column of white light, silent and absolute, erupted from the hole where the Citadel's entrance had been. It shot into the night sky, and for a single, terrifying second, it was day. Then, as quickly as it came, the light was gone. The ground settled. The roaring stopped. There was only silence. We crept to the edge and looked down. There was no hole, no staircase, no rubble. Just smooth, undisturbed sand, glowing faintly as if it had been baked. The vitrified citadel of Varana, and Kalen with it, was gone. Erased. We walked for 2 days, half dead from exhaustion and dehydration, before we stumbled upon a Bedouin caravan that took us back to civilization. We didn't speak a word about what had happened. There were no words for it. How do you explain that you fought rock monsters and watched a man run back into a dying, reality-bending city to ensure it died properly? Back in London, the rain felt like a blessing. My bookshop was exactly as I had left it, a quiet haven of paper and ink, a world away from the glass nightmares beneath the sand. It felt like a dream. But the burns on my hands from the rope and the phantom echo of psychic whispers in my mind told me it was real. Jack came by a week later. He looked tired. He placed a heavy canvas bag on my counter. "My share," he said gruffly. "You keep it. I'm paid up." He looked around the dusty shop. "He's really gone, isn't he?" "I think so," I said quietly. "Damn fool," Jack muttered, though there was no heat in it, only a profound, weary respect. "The quiet ones are always the craziest." He turned to leave. If you find another map to a place that shouldn't exist, give me a call. The world's a bloody, boring place without a bit of madness." And he was gone. I was alone again, in the silence of my shop. It should have been a comfort, but it felt empty now. I spent the evening going through my satchel, a relic from another life. The bronze book was gone, likely disintegrated in the final cataclysm. But one thing had survived. Tucked into an inner pocket, wrapped in a piece of cloth, was the crystalline sphere from the Whispering Garden, the key. Kalen must have slipped it into my pack. Why? I unwrapped it and placed it on my desk. In the dim light of my lamp, it was just a sphere of dark, smoky crystal. Inert. Useless. I was about to put it away when I noticed something. A faint light, no bigger than a pinprick, glowing deep within its core. I picked up my loupe, my hand trembling, and peered inside. It wasn't just a light, it was a pattern, a complex, multi-layered spiral, the symbol Kalen had called the key to the cage. But now, it was different. It was overlaid with another pattern, a star chart. But it showed no constellations I recognized. The arrangement of the stars, their very physics, seemed alien. And at the center of the chart, one star system was highlighted. Next to it was a single, impossibly small symbol, etched in light. It was a mark I had seen only once before. In the frantic final pages of Father Mateo's journal. He had scrawled it next to a passage about a place far colder and older than Varana, a place spoken of by the tribe in hushed tones. A tomb of the sleeping god, hidden beneath the ice of the Antarctic. Kalen hadn't run back into the citadel to die. He had run back to find an answer, or a path, and he had left me a map. My heart began to beat faster, a familiar rhythm of fear and exhilarating curiosity. This wasn't the end of the story. It wasn't even the beginning of the end. Varana was just one city, the Azura just one warden, the Bronze Book was just one chapter. I looked at the glowing sphere, the map to an impossible place, a key to a lock I couldn't yet imagine. This, I realized, was the first chronicle, and my work, our work, had only just begun.